It was a typical bustling morning at Los Angeles International Airport, the heart of a city where everyone seemed to be in a hurry, yet somehow nothing ever truly moved faster. The gates were alive with activity. Trolleys of luggage, clattering footsteps of hurried travelers, and the occasional shout of a gate agent. Amidst the chaos there stood a man, looking every bit like the millions of other passengers heading off to some unknown destination. But there was something different about him. He stood in the first-class line, patiently waiting, his movements deliberate and calm, in stark contrast to the whirlwind of people around him. Keanu Reeves didn't look like someone who belonged to the world of luxury flights and private lounges. Dressed in a simple plaid shirt, worn jeans, and scuffed boots, he appeared almost ordinary. A man of the people. His backpack, well worn from years of travel, hung carelessly over his shoulder. There was no designer logo, no flashy accessories to demand attention, and yet there was a quiet strength about him, something that seemed to draw the eye without effort. Perhaps it was the way he moved, as though unaffected by the frantic pace of those around him, as if he had mastered the art of being present in the moment. As Keanu stood in line, a man behind him, Victor Harding, couldn't help but observe. Victor was the complete opposite of Keanu, dressed in an expensive suit, polished shoes that gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, and a scent of cologne that almost screamed for attention. His every movement seemed deliberate, calculated, as if he was performing for an audience that was always watching. As his gaze landed on Keanu, he couldn't help but feel a mix of disdain and superiority. Here was a man in a place reserved for the elite, yet he looked like he didn't belong, like he was out of his depth. Unable to hold back his judgment, Victor sneered and let out a low chuckle. "First class, huh?" he remarked with a smirk, his voice dripping with condescension. "You never know who might show up here these days." His words hung in the air, an attempt to belittle the man in front of him. Keanu turned slightly, his calm eyes meeting Victor's, but said nothing. It was as if the comment didn't even register. His gaze remained steady, unaffected, as though he had heard such things 1,000 times before and was no longer moved by them. Victor, expecting a reaction, frowned. The absence of any response seemed to unsettle him, as if his words had no power in this situation. Victor pushed forward, determined to force a response. "Look, no offense, but you don't seem like the type who flies like this," he added, his tone mocking. "It's rare to see someone so casual in first class. You sure you're in the right line?" Still, Keanu remained silent. There was something disarming about his lack of reaction. His simple presence, the very way he carried himself, was enough to diffuse Victor's attempts at superiority. Keanu didn't need to say anything to assert himself. His peace spoke louder than any words ever could. Victor's sense of superiority only grew. He saw in Keanu nothing more than a man who had somehow stumbled into a world he didn't belong to. But as the line began to move and they continued to the boarding gate, something would soon change. Something neither of them could have anticipated. As the boarding process continued, the two men found themselves walking side by side, heading toward the first-class cabin. Victor's thoughts swirled as they moved closer to their seats. There was an unsettling energy building inside him, a gnawing feeling that Keanu's calmness, his seemingly effortless presence, was somehow more powerful than the polished arrogance that Victor wore like a second skin. But Victor wouldn't let go of his position. He was in control. At least, that's what he told himself. He wasn't about to let this man, who appeared so out of place in this realm of exclusivity, undermine his carefully constructed world view. As they entered the plane, Victor's disbelief grew. He had expected Keanu to walk off to some remote seat in the back, hidden from the prying eyes of the elite few who resided in first class. But instead, Keanu moved toward the seat directly next to his. It was as if fate itself had placed them together. Victor's face flushed with irritation as he slumped into his seat, staring at the man who had defied every assumption he had made in those first few moments. "Well, this should be interesting," Victor muttered under his breath, though Keanu did not react. He simply sat, adjusting his backpack under the seat in front of him with the same unhurried grace. There was no shift in Keanu's demeanor, no acknowledgement of the awkwardness in the air. His serenity, his quiet strength, only seemed to increase the tension between them. Then Victor leaned back, his arms crossed in a defensive posture, unwilling to admit the discomfort that was beginning to creep in. The disparity between them was too obvious to ignore, yet Keanu seemed completely unaffected by it. The more Victor watched him, the more unsettled he became. There was something in Keanu's calmness that seemed to challenge everything Victor held to be true. Unable to resist, Victor decided to speak. But it wasn't a friendly conversation he wanted. It was a chance to reaffirm his dominance, to remind Keanu of the clear divide between them. "So, what do you do for a living?" he asked, his tone dripping with an air of superiority. "I'm guessing you don't exactly work in high finance, huh?" Keanu looked up from adjusting his seatbelt, his expression still calm, almost unreadable. "I work in film," he replied, his voice steady. Victor raised an eyebrow, feigning interest. "Oh, so commercials, I bet. Small-time stuff," he said with a dismissive laugh, certain that he had just pegged this man as a small fish in a big pond. Keanu, unfazed, simply smiled. "Something like that," he replied softly, his voice not one of defensiveness but of quiet acceptance. Victor, however, could not leave well enough alone. His need to assert his place in the world was insatiable, and Keanu's refusal to react the way he expected only fueled the fire inside him. "You know," Victor continued, his words now taking on a sharper edge, "I've always found it interesting how people try to find their place, but some places just aren't meant for everyone. Like first class, for example." The words were sharp, meant to hurt, but Keanu didn't flinch. Instead, he looked at Victor directly, his eyes filled not with judgment, but with something far more disarming. Understanding. "I think we all have our place," Keanu said, his voice gentle but firm. "And sometimes it's exactly where we are." Victor let out a short, forced laugh, masking his discomfort. "Nice philosophy," he said, leaning back in his seat, "but real life isn't as simple as that." Keanu didn't engage further. Instead, he turned his gaze to the window, signaling the end of the conversation. But Victor wasn't done. He couldn't let go of the uneasy feeling that Keanu's calmness was revealing something he wasn't ready to face, something deeper within himself. The flight attendant arrived with the in-flight service, and Victor, eager to reassert control, made sure his presence was known. "A glass of champagne, please," he said, flashing a confident smile. "Something that matches the exclusivity of this seat." When it was Keanu's turn, he simply asked for a bottle of water. Victor couldn't resist the chance to make another remark. "Water?" he scoffed, his voice incredulous. "You're in first class, and you're going to waste it on water?" Keanu took the water with a calm smile, his eyes meeting Victor's. "I'm fine with this," he said simply. "Sometimes simplicity is enough." Victor scowled, his eyes narrowing in judgment. "I guess that works for people who settle for less," he muttered, almost under his breath. Keanu's gaze remained steady. "Maybe the best is different for everyone," he said, his voice steady but filled with an undeniable wisdom. Victor, unwilling to accept that his provocations weren't having the desired effect, pressed on, his tone now more forceful. "Not everyone is born to enjoy the best life has to offer, Keanu," he said, his words laced with a sense of superiority. Keanu smiled, almost as if he were speaking to someone who could not yet see beyond their own limited view. "Perhaps," he said softly, "but sometimes what we think we deserve and what we truly need are two very different things." In that moment, the clash between the two men became more than just a conversation. It was a clash of values, a stark contrast between Victor's desire for validation through material success and Keanu's understanding of a deeper, more meaningful success, one that came not from what was shown to the world, but from the quiet power of being content with oneself. The rest of the passengers on the plane, who had been quietly observing, began to take notice. Some exchanged glances, others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. But Keanu remained unchanged, his presence serene and steady, an anchor in the storm of Victor's insecurity. As the plane continued its journey, The tension between Victor and Keanu lingered in the air like an unspoken battle. Victor's provocations had escalated, but still, Keanu remained untouched. His words simple yet profound, his demeanor unchanged by the waves of superiority that Victor tried to project. The surrounding passengers, who had initially been passive observers, were now fully aware of the simmering tension between the two men. Their glances flickered back and forth, some intrigued, others uncomfortable, as the quiet conflict unfolded in the first-class cabin. Victor, though outwardly composed, could feel the walls he had so carefully built around himself begin to crack. His attempts to dominate the conversation were losing their grip, and he could feel his confidence slipping. He had spent his life cultivating an image of success, a man who had everything that others desired, a man who was always in control. But in Keanu's presence, that control seemed hollow, as if the very foundation of his beliefs was being questioned. Determined to regain the upper hand, Victor pushed forward, his voice growing more forceful. "You know," he said, leaning in toward Keanu, "life is like flying first class. You work hard, earn your spot, and then you get to enjoy the fruits of your labor. Some people, though—" He paused for effect, his gaze intense. "Some people are just lucky to be here. They don't deserve it." Keanu turned slowly to face him, his eyes calm, but there was a subtle firmness in his gaze now. He didn't need to say much, but the weight of his words carried a quiet authority that made Victor pause. "Luck or hard work," Keanu replied, his tone serene but unwavering. "We all end up in the same place when the flight lands, don't we?" Victor froze for a moment. The words hit him harder than he expected. It wasn't just an observation. It was a truth that resonated deep within him. The flight, the luxury of first class, the champagne, the designer clothes, none of it mattered when the journey was over. In the end, everyone was headed to the same destination. There was no escaping that universal truth. Keanu, as if sensing Victor's internal struggle, continued, his voice steady. "The value of being here," he said, gesturing around the cabin, "is not about what you have, but how you treat others." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Victor's posture shifted, as if the weight of Keanu's calm philosophy had finally begun to penetrate the walls of his arrogance. Around them, a few passengers exchanged glances, their expressions telling a silent story of approval. They had been silently watching the exchange, and it was clear that Keanu's quiet strength was beginning to win them over. Victor, still clinging to his need to be right, tried to deflect, but his words now felt weak, lacking the conviction he had once carried with ease. "That's nice, Keanu," he said, attempting to laugh it off. "A little self-help philosophy, but the real world doesn't work that way." Keanu, however, didn't flinch. His calmness remained unshaken, as if he understood that true success wasn't about competing with others or displaying wealth. It was about internal peace and the way one treated others. "Maybe," he replied softly, "but true success doesn't need to be shouted about. It speaks for itself." Victor's gaze faltered for a moment. The words seemed to linger in the cabin, resonating not just with him, but with everyone who had been quietly listening. A few moments passed in silence, the tension still palpable, but this time it wasn't just Victor who felt it. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. The flight attendant, who had been moving around the cabin, paused for a moment, sensing the shift in energy. She glanced at Keanu, her eyes filled with respect. The other passengers, once passive, now leaned in, aware that something significant was happening in this seemingly ordinary exchange between two men. Victor, unable to shake off the growing discomfort, shifted in his seat. He looked out the window, but it was clear that his thoughts were elsewhere. Keanu, on the other hand, had returned to his calm, collected self. His quiet words had already made an impact, one that Victor wasn't prepared for. He had expected to be the one in control, the one who dictated the narrative, but now, for the first time in a long while, Victor was questioning everything he thought he knew about success, value, and the true meaning of living. The flight continued in a stillness that seemed to echo the internal struggle Victor was facing. Keanu, though, remained unchanged. His presence was an unspoken reminder that there was more to life than the external markers of success, and for the first time, Victor began to realize that perhaps the things he had been chasing, status, wealth, power, weren't the true indicators of a life well lived. It was then that the truth, so carefully concealed, was about to reveal itself. And with that revelation would come the final shift that would change everything for Victor. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin had shifted. The previous tension between Keanu and Victor, which had simmered beneath the surface, was now palpable to every passenger within earshot. Conversations had quieted, the occasional clink of glass and hum of the plane's engines the only background noise. In the midst of it all, Victor's discomfort grew as he realized the full weight of the words Keanu had spoken. The calm, almost effortless wisdom that Keanu had exuded during their exchange began to gnaw at Victor's core. It was as though everything he had believed about status, success, and power had been gently but irreversibly turned upside down. Victor had spent his life striving for validation, collecting achievements, flaunting success, building walls around himself that kept his insecurities at bay. But now, sitting next to Keanu, he couldn't ignore the creeping feeling that his carefully constructed world was a mere illusion. Keanu's unassuming presence, his lack of need to prove anything, had cracked through the defenses Victor had spent years perfecting. Victor fidgeted in his seat, his hands gripping the armrests as his mind raced. He had wanted to dominate this conversation, to put Keanu in his place, but instead, Keanu had turned the tables with nothing more than his quiet strength. The more Victor thought about it, the more unsettled he became. Perhaps he had been mistaken all along. Perhaps true success wasn't measured by the luxury you could afford or the power you could wield. Maybe it was about something deeper, something that didn't come with a price tag. He glanced over at Keanu, who remained serene, looking out the window, lost in the world outside. Keanu's ability to maintain his composure, to remain undisturbed by the external chaos, had become almost otherworldly in Victor's eyes. It was a quiet confidence that Victor could not replicate, no matter how hard he tried, and that realization struck him harder than any insult or snide remark could have. The flight attendant approached Keanu with a polite smile, her voice breaking the heavy silence that had settled between the two men. "Mr. Reeves, the captain asked me to inform you that your connection in Tokyo is confirmed. He also sends his best regards." The name Reeves echoed through the cabin, and for the first time, the entire plane seemed to take notice. Passengers who had been discreetly watching their conversation now stared openly, their eyes wide in recognition. Some leaned in closer, eager to see the truth for themselves, while others began to exchange whispers under their breath. The realization that Keanu Reeves, the beloved actor, was sitting beside them had an immediate impact, one that sent ripples through the cabin. Victor, who had been so convinced of his superiority, sat frozen. The world around him seemed to blur as the truth of who Keanu was sank in. He wasn't just some ordinary man in first class. He was someone who had earned his place in the world, not by flaunting his success, but by living with integrity and humility. The realization hit Victor like a tidal wave. All the assumptions he had made, the judgments about Keanu's worth, the dismissive remarks about his simple attire, had been completely wrong. He had spent the entire flight looking down on the man beside him, only to discover that Keanu Reeves was not just another passenger. He was a symbol of something greater than wealth or status. He was someone who had learned to live with purpose and grace. The passengers around them began to stir, some even nodding their heads in quiet admiration. They had witnessed a powerful shift in the dynamic between the two men. Victor, once so sure of his place in the world, now seemed smaller, humbled by the revelation of Keanu's true identity. His posture had slumped, his self-assuredness all but vanished. The air of superiority he had carried with him throughout the flight now seemed out of place, almost foolish in comparison to Keanu's quiet wisdom. Keanu, however, remained unaffected by the attention. His smile, soft and genuine, was the only indication that he was aware of the stir he had caused. He didn't need to make a grand statement or boast about his achievements. His life, his presence, spoke for itself. He had no need to prove anything. because his actions, his words, and his character were enough. For Victor, the lesson had been learned too late. The image he had built of himself, his status, his wealth, and his perceived superiority had crumbled in the face of true humility. Keanu had never once tried to diminish him. It was his own arrogance that had done the damage. In the end, Victor was left to confront the emptiness that came with seeking validation from the wrong places. The flight continued in a newfound silence, the tension between Keanu and Victor dissipating as the latter sat deep in thought, reflecting on everything he had just learned. The passengers, once indifferent, now seemed to hold a shared understanding. They had witnessed something rare on that flight. Not a confrontation, but a subtle yet profound lesson in humility, respect, and the true meaning of success. Victor, now realizing the futility of his earlier actions, began to question everything he had once held dear. In the presence of a man who had nothing to prove, he was forced to confront the painful truth that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in what we accumulate, but in how we live and how we treat others along the way. As the flight continued, a deep sense of reflection hung over the cabin. For Victor, the realization of who Keanu Reeves truly was had shattered his previous worldview. He had spent so much of his life chasing external validation, constantly striving for status, wealth, and recognition. Yet in that moment, he saw what he had been missing all along. True success was never about the things we acquire or the places we find ourselves in. It was about the way we treated others, the kindness we extended, and the integrity with which we lived our lives. Keanu's example had shown him that the most valuable thing anyone can possess is not a title, a luxury car, or a designer suit. It's a quiet confidence, a humble spirit, and an ability to remain true to oneself, no matter the external circumstances. Keanu had taught Victor a lesson that would last far beyond that flight, that humility, compassion, and self-awareness are what truly define a person. For the rest of the passengers, the exchange between Keanu and Victor had sparked a deeper understanding as well. They had witnessed the power of words, the strength that comes with quiet wisdom, and the importance of staying grounded in the face of pride and arrogance. In a world that often elevates superficial success, Keanu's simple yet profound example served as a reminder that the most important things in life cannot be seen with the eyes. They must be felt with the heart. If you found inspiration in this story, let it remind you that real success isn't measured by what we have, but by who we are and how we treat those around us. Keanu Reeves' calm, peaceful presence is a testament to the power of humility in a world that often rewards boastfulness. The next time you feel the need to prove yourself or assert your place in the world, remember this story. It's not about what others see, it's about the impact you make on the lives of those around you. If you've enjoyed this story and the lesson it brings, we'd love for you to join us on this journey. Subscribe to our channel to stay tuned for more thought-provoking stories that inspire reflection and growth. And we invite you to share your thoughts